I'd like to introduce everybody. Thank you for coming to this discourse that we're having today on martyrdom and the dialectics of religion, especially as it relates to Ashura, that happened this year in 2021, just last week. My name is Dr. Dustin Bird. I'm an associate professor of philosophy, religion, and Arabic at Olivet College. I'm also the founder and editor-in-chief of Ekperosis Press, which is one of the organizations that's sponsoring the discourse today, as well as the Center for Inter-Civilizational Discourse and Dialogue. And so I'm hoping that we have everyone here today and we all learn from something about martyrdom and the dialectical nature of martyrdom and as it relates to religion in the secular world, as well as maybe even current events. So with that, I hand it over to my dear brother, Syed Javed Miri.
Thank you very much. My name is Syed Jawad Miri from the Institute of Humanities and Cultural Studies in Iran. I thank everybody, and we are going to start our discourse on Ashura. And with that said, we go first to Professor Rudolf Siebert. The floor is yours, Professor. 15 up to 20 minutes.
That's me?
Yes. That's
okay. Okay.
The floor is yours, Dr. Siebert.
Okay, very good. I am Professor Emeritus of Comparative Religion, and I have a story. I would like to start out with a story from my youth in fascist Germany about a Jewish woman on the way to the concentration camp. The story shows the martyrdom which counter-revolutionary, exclusive, authoritarian populism or fascism can mean for Jews, Christians, socialists, and communists, and other victims. Then I would like to discuss shortly the possible causes of anti-Semitism, Moses and Jesus as religious revolutionaries and martyrs of freedom. The encounter with the friendly Jewish lady happened in Frankfurt, which had a large Jewish community in March 1941, almost 3 years after the Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, or the November pogrom from November 9 to 10, 1938. It was carried out by exclusive right-wing authoritarian populist paramilitary SA forces and masses of civilians throughout Germany in the framework of fascist identity philosophy of life and ideology and politics, while the German authorities looked on without intervening and even sympathetically. Ideology understood here critically as false consciousness, masking of particular economic and political interests, shortly the untruth. I have to shorten all this now. I'm talking about the actuality of this story in terms of right-wing happenings here in Michigan, attacks at the governors, and of course, January 6th. And also in terms of happenings at that time. So the Kristallnacht, all this, I suppose that it is very well known. And also in terms of an experiment which Hitler made when he sent a ship with 800 Jewish people to North America in order to prove that nobody wanted to have the Jews. And in reality, in Cuba and in New York, the ship was rejected, and the captain was supposed to take the Jews home to Germany again. He won the ship against the rocks in England, and so all the Jews were rescued, but then they were put into internment camps, and then they were delivered back to Belgium and Holland. And when the Germans marched into those countries, they were then put into concentration camps. So all this is somewhat connected to the story, but I cannot go into it in detail. The whole story happened in Frankfurt on my way one morning to my high school, the so-called Lessing Gymnasium, Lessing, a great German enlightener. And I had an accident with my bicycle. I had to push it. And there I met this lady with her big suitcases, and I carried them down to the Lessing Gymnasium, to the air shelter, where all the Jews of Frankfurt, or many of them, were collected in order to be brought to the east into the concentration camps. And there we passed by, when I carried her suitcases down, we passed by to the IG Farben building, in which the Cyclone B was prepared for the gassing operations, which started with in the middle of the war, when Germany entered the war with the United States, and the whole thing became a real world war. I want to go right into the middle of the story, since my time is very limited. And when the Jewish lady and I arrived at the entrance of the air shelter of the so-called Lessing Gymnasium with my bicycle and her suitcases on it, we heard from below the voices of many people, Jews from all over Frankfurt. Soon a young SS-man from the Schutzstaffel, a major paramilitary organization under Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, and Heinrich Himmler, came running up the staircase from the air shelter basement below. The SS was recruited from the German bourgeoisie. Its members had often the same classical humanistic education which I received in the Lessing Gymnasium. After a bloody Jewish pogrom initiated by the SS, for instance, in Warsaw or elsewhere, they could easily play on the next leftover piano, Beethoven's or Mozart's bourgeois revolutionary symphonies in the midst of the ruins they themselves had created. The competing opposite of the SS was the SA, the Sturmabteilung, or assault division by named stormtroopers, or brown shirts, part of the Nazi Party, also a paramilitary organization. Their methods of violent intimidation played a large role in Adolf Hitler's rise to power. The SA was recruited from the German proletariat and was much less educated. Not the SA, but part of the SS, besides the SS elite tank divisions, was in charge of the concentration camps, first as labor and finally as death camps. I again have to jump over. As a matter of fact, the SS-man was so shocked by what he saw that he could not speak for some time. Then he composed himself and started to shout with his loudest commando voice, so that all the teachers and students in the classrooms of the Lessing Gymnasium could clearly hear him. How can you, as an Aryan boy, carry the suitcases of a Jewish pig? It is a scandal. I answered him that the old Jewish woman did not look like a pig, but rather like my grandmother. That response made the SS-man even angrier, as if he suspected that I had a Jewish grandmother. But that was not the case. My father, Bruno Siebert, bourgeois family tree was totally Aryan down to the 16th century. Admittedly, my mother and her brother looked Jewish and were often suspected of being Jewish. Adolf, working in the Dresdner Bank in Frankfurt throughout his life, became a member of the NSDAP and so on. We finally then, after this much shouting, we went over to the director of the gymnasium. In his anger, the SS-man took me and my bicycle to the director of the Lessing Gymnasium, Dr. Silomon, who was one of the so-called noble Nazis who had written a book on the Indo-Germanic language community. The SS-man shouted at him as well, "What kind of students do you educate here? They help Jewish pigs carrying their suitcases. It is a shame." The SS-man demanded that I had to be punished for my treacherous non-German deed. Dr. Silomon remained silent. He just looked at me sadly as if he wanted to say, "Why did you have to do this to us?" I must admit to the honor of the Lessing Gymnasium that I was never punished for my helping the Jewish lady. 4 years later, after the end of the war, I witnessed to that in my teachers' denazification procedures in their favor, and they were grateful for this. 2 years earlier, in 1941, after the SS-man had been done with his shouting at the Jewish lady and me and even Dr. Silomon, I was allowed to return belatedly to my classroom. When I walked through the halls of the Lessing Gymnasium, which 4 years later would be bombed out by the Allied bombers, while the nearby IG Farben administration building was saved, I passed by a classroom in which a Catholic priest called lovingly Frog by the students taught in Hebrew from the book of Exodus of the Hebrew Bible about the Mosaic 10 Commandments, while all of them were violated against the Jews down in the air shelter basement, including the friendly and frightened Jewish lady from Frankfurt, whose nation had once produced them, the second and third commandment, anticipating the image and nameless prohibition of Immanuel Kant, the greatest bourgeois enlightener, a colleague of Lessing. The priest could teach religion in a public school in Nazi Germany, which is not possible here now, on the basis of the Empire Concordat concluded between Adolf Hitler and the Vatican, which treaty is still valid today in 2021 in the German Federal Republic. On the second floor of the Lessing Gymnasium, I passed by a classroom in which a teacher taught in Greek about the dialogues of Socrates, as reported by Plato, and all what they had to say about truth and justice, while the greatest untruth and injustice was committed against the Jews down in the air shelter basement, including the friendly Jewish lady from Frankfurt. When I finally arrived at my own classroom and sat down in my seat, I found Dr. Schumann teaching in Latin out of Ovid, Publius Ovidius Naso, a Roman poet from the reign of Emperor Augustus and from the time of Jesus of Nazareth. Ovid was noted especially for his Amatoria and Metamorphoses. Dr. Schumann belonged to the Swiss theologian Karl Barth's movement of confessing church, which opposed and resisted the fascist exclusive identity ideology and politics and anti-Semitism, and the Lutheran Empire Bishop Müller community of German Christians who followed and supported Adolf Hitler. The Calvinistic dialectical theologian Barth thought that the great philosopher and theologian Hegel should become, he is standing beside me here behind me, that Thomas of Aquinas of the modern Protestants, and maybe also of the modern Catholics, so that both may be rescued from the secular bourgeois Marxian and Freudian enlightenment, emphasizing mimesis rather than cult, as also did the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer in his Religionless Christianity, and paid for this witness with his martyrdom, martyr death, through being nakedly hanged in the concentration camp of Flossenburg in Bavaria in 1945, in the last moments of World War II. Barth and Bonhoeffer applied radically Jesus' teachings against their pagan, idolatrous fascists, who, besides being God-gläubig or God-believing and talking about the Almighty, the Lord, the Providence, were also petit bourgeois authoritarian enlighteners, as such denying the fear of God, as the German tribesmen had once denied the fear of the gods at the time of Tacitus, as well as miracles, angels, and Satan, and believed that man was good by nature and that there were no sins or guilt, but at best only mistakes, and that love should always be without pain. Most Nazi leaders never felt guilty about or repented what was done to the Jews in the air shelter of the Lessing Gymnasium in 1941, and to the friendly Jewish woman among them, and to all the other Jewish victims. They only regretted that they had not murdered more, or all of them. Many other Germans thought the same. When after the war, one of my cousins participated as judge in the Auschwitz trial in Frankfurt, he got white hairs in a short time, not only because of the terrible crimes he heard about, but also because of the pressure from the population that he should not stand against and judge his own German countrymen who had only done their duty for the fatherland in great danger. Already before the war, some fascists had tried to revert back behind the Abrahamic religions to the Trinitarian Gothic religion of blood and soil and the beliefs in Thor, Wotan, Odin, Freya, and Valhalla. The unconfessing Christian and humanist Dr. Schumann compared the present fascist age with the late Roman Empire and its dramatic decline into barbarism. He liked to present to his class the Latin church songs of the Catholic Middle Ages. He was very ecumenical. Dr. Schumann did not shy away from criticizing bravely the fascist news of the last night when he came into the classroom in the morning. His fearless standard statement after a short news analysis was always, "They have bloodily, awfully, lousily cheated us again." Dr. Schumann made skeptical and cynical remarks and jokes after mentally and intellectually somewhat limited Nazi leaders had addressed the faculty and student body over the radio. For instance, Dr. Lai, the often drunk Minister of Labor in the fascist empire. As Dr. Schumann was teaching in class, he always used to walk up and down the room, continually holding the handkerchief to his nose. And this morning, after he had heard the SS-men shouting at the Jewish lady and me, and even at Director Silomon through the open windows some time before, he came to my seat and bent down and looked at me through his very thick glasses. And he was not angry at all because of my being late, but there was a great smile in his eyes, which seemed to say that he was proud of me and the help I had given to the Jewish lady. After the SS-men shouting my status as a token proletariat was greatly lifted among students and faculty, and soon afterwards I was elevated to the leader and speaker of the class which I remained through the years and decades to come. Now, again, I have to jump over a lot of stories which are connected. And I want to come to the second part. I had many discussions with rabbis through the years about the causes of anti-Semitism. They told me it was a mystery. I personally thought that perhaps the ethical monotheism of Abraham and finally of Moses, the revolutionary, and his suffering and martyrdom had something to do with anti-Semitism, or more specifically anti-Judaism, in the dialectic of the history of nations and of religions, particularly the principle of equality. When the Israelites, on the basis of their radical monotheism, told other nations around them that their gods, the highest in their lives, were mere idols who had eyes and could not see, and had ears and could not hear, and had legs and could not walk, and that not they were eating the sacrifices, but rather the priests, and rejected their cultic rules and ethics, then this genuine enlightenment did certainly not make them any friends, but rather provoked hate, anger, and aggression. Moses did not only oppose the gods of the Egyptians, like Pharaoh and Akhenaton had done when he introduced his kind of monotheism and thereby lost the loyalty of his people. Moses, beyond his ethical monotheism, killed a slaveholder supervisor. He had to flee Egypt. He went into exile. Later on, he returned to Egypt and liberated the Hebrew slaves in the name of the God Yahweh through attacking the Pharaoh and the Egyptian slaveholder class. He did not overthrow the ruling slaveholder class as a revolutionary would usually do, like Spartacus tried to do. But he did free the Hebrew slaves 500 years before Cyrus the Great of Persia. The Zoroastrian outlawed slavery on his Civil Rights Manifesto in the name of his god Ahura Mazda, or simply Mazda, the first person in the Zoroastrian Trinity, followed by Mithras and Ahriman. Moses was a revolutionary in the sense that he founded a new state on the basis of a covenant with Yahweh and of 10 commandments by him. Moses was a martyr of freedom, not only in the sense that he suffered from the Egyptian slaveholders, but also from his own people, which fell back into polytheism, making for themselves the Egyptian fertility god, the golden calf, while he was talking with Yahweh on Mount Sinai. Moses' brother Aaron even joined the regressive, rebellious masses. They were angry against Moses because he led them instead of into the Holy Land with milk and honey, into the desert without bread and water. They longed to return into slavery, where they had at least enough to eat and drink. Moses and Aaron were even punished by their God Yahweh because they lost momentarily faith in him. They had to die before the people reached the Holy Land. In the 20th century, Jews, Christians, and socialists and communists were murdered because of their Mosaic principle of equality, by exclusive right-wing authoritarian populists, by fascists who follow their ethics of aristocratic principle of nature, of the inequality of races, nations, gender, and classes. In the Project Barbarossa, alone 6 million Jews and 26 million so-called communists were murdered by 4 million baptized Europeans invading and occupying the Soviet Union. Also, Rabbi Jesus could be called a martyrized revolutionary, like Moses, in spite of the fact that also he did not violently overthrow a ruling class, be it slaveholders, feudal lords, or capitalists. Jesus, as a good Jew, celebrated the Pascha meal in which the Jewish people remembered every year on Easter their liberation from Egyptian slavery through Moses in the name of Yahweh. Rabbi Jesus followed Moses' law, the 10 Commandments, but Jesus was also critical of Moses because he allowed divorce against the original will of Yahweh, yielding to the Jews' hardness of the heart or inability to learn. Jesus replaced Moses' old covenant by his own new covenant during his last Pascha meal in Jerusalem. In the year 30, Jesus initiated the dialectical transition from Judaism to Christianity, the determinate negation of the Mosaic law, its critique, and its preservation. Jesus stated, "Do not imagine that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to complete them. For I tell you, if your virtue goes no deeper than that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never get into the kingdom of heaven. You have learned how it was said to our ancestors, you must not kill, and if anyone does kill, he must answer for it before the court. But I say this to you, anyone who is angry with his brother will answer for it before the court." There is a difference between Moses and Jesus, a revolutionary radicalization. In the name of this difference, Jesus provoked the Jewish and the Roman ruling class. The tensions grew toward Easter 30. Jesus told his opponents that they were not the sons of Abraham, but rather the sons of Satan, because they wanted to kill him. He finally marched with his friends and followers up to Jerusalem and the temple, which Cyrus the Persian had rebuilt 500 years earlier. But the ruling classes in Jerusalem and Palestine did not accept him and his movement and his kingdom of heaven, his truth. During his Last Supper, he was betrayed to the priests by Judas Iscariot, the man from Kariot, a suburb of Jerusalem. Jesus knew that the revolution was lost. He was arrested on Mount Olive, sentenced in the Sanhedrin on the charge of blasphemy, and by the Roman governor, the mass murderer Pontius Pilate, on the charge of high treason, and was tortured and crucified on Calvary. But his friends announced his resurrection and ascension, that the murderers had not triumphed over the innocent victim. Jesus' revolution of painful sacrificial love was remembered, and innumerable revolutionary martyrs followed him under slaveholder, feudal, and capitalistic systems, even into the 20th and 21st centuries. Thus, Archbishop Romero and his liberation theologians carried the Jesus revolution into Nicaragua and tried to bring justice and equality to the coffee plantation workers and their families, and were killed by the fascist Arena Party and government, defending the right of native and foreign capitalists to privately appropriate the collective surplus labor. Romero, the liberation theologians, and 70,000 basic Christian community members were murdered, martyrized revolutionaries. Romero was canonized by Pope Francis and the Church, and all the other martyrs who died with him were saints like him as well. The revolution and the martyrdom of freedom and justice and equality and brotherhood and sisterhood continues today on all continents. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Siebert.
Thank you very much, Professor Siebert.
You are
Now
welcome.
What? Sorry, I didn't catch what you said.
You are welcome.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now the floor is for, I think, Sister Mahjabin is here. If Dr. Mahjabin is here.
Yeah,
I'm here, but I would prefer to go a little later, if that's okay with you. It's like very early in California, and my speaking aloud is going to really disturb my family members.
Okay, no problem, no problem. will go to Professor Farid Al-Attas. Professor Al-Attas, the floor is yours.
Good morning. I don't know what the times are. Actually, I'm confused by now. Maybe in morning. Good morning to some of you, or good afternoon. You know, there are so many issues to raise with regard to this topic concerning Ashura and the story of Karbala. And these issues can be raised at the theological level, at the historical level, but also at the sociological level. They need also to be discussed within particular contexts. The context that I would like to discuss this in is that of sectarianism in the Muslim world today. And I'll come back to the point of sectarianism later. But let me begin with a few points with regard to the story of Ashura. Basically, what I plan to do is to say a few words about the position of Imam Hussein and Ashura, how the story of Karbala is regarded today, and how that is relevant to the issue of the problem of sectarianism, and then finally to talk about the historical significance of Ashura, perhaps more from a sociological point of view. And I have to apologize that there's not much time to discuss these things, and one has to assume prior knowledge about many of these historical events, which might not always be true. So let me begin with the image or the place of the story of Karbala among Muslims today. Now, it's a complex issue, but I want to simplify it, and I want to focus on this point, that while many scholars throughout the ages have regarded Hussein as a symbol of justice and a point of unity between different Muslim communities, what I find interesting today is that among the Sunni community, he is largely forgotten. Sunnis have largely forgotten Hussein, they've largely forgotten Ashura. And when I say that, it's not that they've not heard of him. Of course, every Muslim, every Sunni has heard of Hussein and knows of him. But when I say forgotten, there's a kind of historical amnesia in the sense that when Ashura comes, among many Sunni communities throughout the world, there is no mention which reflects a lack of consciousness about what actually happened on Ashura. So there's no reference to Karbala. There are references to what I would refer to as false traditions, sort of invented traditions. Maybe that's a better term. The 10th of Muharram is said to have been various events are said to have taken place on the 10th of Muharram, such as the landing of Noah's Ark, the saving of the Prophet Abraham from fire, and other events concerning other prophets are said to have taken place on the 10th of Muharram, on Ashura. There is no basis to these traditions actually in the text. And I think if one were to give an explanation, a sociological explanation to the existence of these traditions, it would be that the dominant powers, probably the Bani Umayyads and the Bani Abbasids, because of of the pro Alawi, pro Alid, pro Alawi or pro Ahl al-Bayt sentiments among the ground, and the sense of the illegitimacy of these regimes, particularly the Umayyads, there was a need to get people to forget about Ashura, about Karbala, and one way to do that was to replace Karbala with other events, which are of course invented, and events that did not actually take place. And if that was the case, it actually worked, because many Sunni Muslims, and I'm talking about probably the majority around the world, do commemorate Ashura in terms of these events. And Ashura is a time of happiness and celebration. The Turks, for example, serve a kind of porridge on Ashura, which they call Ashura. They actually call the porridge Ashura, and it's supposed to be a time of celebration, not a time of contemplation and mourning. So this is the problem of the Sunnis. Now the problem of the Shiites, to me, equally problematic. There's certainly no historical amnesia among the Shiites. They remember it, but I would say to the point of rendering Hussein and rendering Karbala as a kind of anesthetic, through the rituals. Karbala is dehistoricized in the sense that it has, in the sense that the rituals emphasize or underlie personal penance and punishment, abstracted from the historical reality in which it took place, and abstracted from current realities, which resemble the situation that Imam Hussein found himself in. So it becomes something abstract and unhistorical, and therefore unrelated to current realities. Current realities in which you have, Yazid's, ruling Muslim countries, including Shiite dominated countries. But Karbala remains almost totally unrelated to those current realities. So in both cases, Hussein, I think, has become largely irrelevant to our lives. At the same time, and this comes to, and now I come to my second point about sectarianism. At the same time, you have, especially in the last decades, an unprecedented playing up of sectarian tensions and conflicts between Sunnis and Shiites throughout the Muslim world, even as far away, I say far away from your point of view, as far away as as far east as Indonesia and Malaysia, where Shiites make up a tiny minority of the total Muslim population. But even in Indonesia and Malaysia, you have persecution of Shiites, and on some occasions even physical violence against them. So this intra-Muslim conflict takes the form of demonization of Shiites, persecution and violence, as I said. And although it's true to say that such conflicts are often initiated by parties with material and political interests, at the same time, it cannot be denied that religious, particularly theological differences, are invoked by both Sunnis and Shiites as they encounter each other. In other words, while the conflicts may be provoked by politicians, the differences that they emphasize are accepted and internalized by ordinary Sunnis and Shiites, who gradually come to harbor stereotypes against each other, about each other. For this reason, I strongly believe that the intellectual resources against Muslim sectarianism need to be developed for the use of those involved in intra-Muslim dialogues. And in my own work, my interest is to actually draw on the work of Sunni, or seminal Sunni thinkers of the past as well as the present, to revive that, to show that consciousness of Hussein, of Karbala, and indeed other Ahl al-Bayt, is very much part of Sunni tradition, and can play a role in terms of rapprochement between Sunnis and Shiites. Now, my third point, which I think helps to consolidate the previous point, has to do with the historical significance and the lessons to be learned from Karbala. And here I draw upon the work of Said Hussein Alatas on the ideals of excellence. Now he spoke about the ideal of excellence, and in doing so he was inspired by the work of the Dutch historian Huizinga, who spoke about the historical ideals of life. Now the concept of the ideal of excellence, the ideal of excellence is defined as the conception of a decent, just, and dignified life. It is in contrast to misery, backwardness, exploitation, ignorance, and disrespect for the dignity of the human individual. The problem, he discussed 4 types of leadership based on the ideals of excellence. The characteristics of these types of leadership are derived from specific historical personalities, such as Imam Ali, as the Caliph Omar ibn Abdul Aziz, and Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi. So it's a sociological approach in the sense that the characteristics of types of leadership that are based on ideals of excellence are derived from historical personalities. Now, the ideals of excellence are contrasted to the ideals of destruction or malevolence, which are exemplified in personalities such as the Caliph Al-Qahir, Sultan Ghiyasuddin Balban, Muhammad Tughlaq, and of course we can include, first and foremost, we can include Yazid. In today's society, there are types of leaders that are also guided by the ideals of excellence, and there are types that are guided by the ideals of malevolence or destruction. Now, I think just to quickly conclude that when we look at the historical case of Karbala, of Ashura, of the events of Ashura, we can say that the conflict between Imam Hussein and Yazid was an historical manifestation of the conflict between 2 value systems. The one based on the ideal of excellence, and the other based on the ideal of destruction, with Yazid amplifying, of course, the latter. It was impossible for Hussein to give the oath of allegiance to Yazid, an immoral man who had blatantly violated any ethical standard. In fact, it was said, and this is, you find this in Sunni sources. For example, Ibn Kathir said that Yazid was often found drunk, given to a decadent lifestyle, and more importantly, implicated in murders. According to As-Suyuti, the historian Jalaluddin As-Suyuti, Yazid was responsible for the Harra incident, in which several companions of the Prophet and their children were killed. For all these reasons, it was impossible for Imam Hussein to give the oath of allegiance to Yazid. Had Hussein done so, it would be said till today that the grandson of the Prophet caved in and pledged allegiance to a corrupt man. The massacre of Karbala is an event that Muslims cannot be neutral about. We are either on the side of the universal moral values and align ourselves with Hussein and his cause, or we take a position that is not contrary, that is contrary to the teachings of Islam, not only to the teachings of Islam, but to all the great religions and humanistic ideologies. Our position with regard to Ashura should have nothing to do with the jurisprudential school or sect that we belong to, or the political philosophy that we subscribe to. Both Sunnis and Shiites ought to be united with regard to the position taken regarding Ashura. There may be differences on how to commemorate Ashura, but this is a secondary issue, and at least it should be agreed upon that Ashura is not a cause for celebration and a time for celebration. It should also be pointed out that what is significant about Ashura is not that Imam Hussein was from the Ahlul Bayt, but that he sacrificed his life for a noble cause. His sacrifice and martyrdom would have been of no lesser importance had he been from any other family. Finally, and I think this is very important, if we are to make productive use of the history of Ashura, of the shocking and deplorable actions of those who claim to be Muslims, we should relate them to our present context. We should ask Muslim politicians and leaders to seriously think about their ideals of excellence and decide if they wish to emulate Imam Hussein or to emulate Yazid. I think we certainly know the answer as to what their choices would have been, judging from their current actions. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm sure you guys may have questions, but we will come back to Q&A at the end of our discussion. Thank you very much, Farid. Now the floor is yours, Professor Dustin J. Bird.
Okay, very good. You guys make such great points. It makes my work redundant. Okay, so I will read some lines that I wrote here for this discourse. So as we watch the complete return of the Taliban to Afghanistan and consequently fear for the future of the Afghan people, pundits, journalists, scholars, sociologists, philosophers ponder why such an archaic movement representing the repressed form of religiosity that has been undermined by the modern world so quickly overcame a well-funded, well-armed, and presumably well-trained Afghan security force. How did a ragtag bunch of religious obscurantists with small arms overtake a state created and propped up by the American empire and its technologically sophisticated military? What accounts for the swiftness of Afghanistan's fall to the Taliban? Surely it was not better tactics or strategy or better trained generals, etc. Something else is afoot. The philosopher Slavoj Žižek recently wrote a piece for Russia Today that attempts to answer that very question. After dismissing the liberal narrative of Afghans aren't ready for the modern Republican form of government, or that their use of terror has shocked everyone into a traumatic state of submission, or that the corrupt nature of Ashraf Ghani's regime weakened the state to the point where it simply was unable to stand against the Taliban, Žižek goes on to suggest that what accounts for the Taliban's success is its, quote, disregard for survival and the readiness of its fighters to assume martyrdom to die not just in battle, but even in suicidal acts, unquote. The realization that hordes of religious believers prepared to forcibly implement their worldview and way of being on a nation or die trying psychologically instills terror in the minds of its victims. Zizek is getting to. There is no compromise with those who are prepared to die for their cause. Just as in the case of a Sufi saint, death brings joy for the jihadist martyr. It's their urs, or their marriage with the divine. Martyrdom, the willful sacrifice of one's life for the advancement of a cause or as a statement of conviction regarding one's faith or beliefs, is a powerful tool in the hands of social, political, and religious movements. The willingness to stare death in the face and accept the reality of human finitude that comes with its judgment remains a mystery to those who are devoid of such convictions. Most humans attempt to push death away as much as possible, even to escape the into thoughtlessness or busyness, intellectual superficiality. In the death-phobic West, in many ways, funerals bring great anxiety, not because individuals struggle with saying goodbye to their loved ones, but rather because of the utter shock they experience facing the reality principle of death, which turns them inward, forcing them to contemplate the horror and terror of their own finitude. Heidegger's being towards death, or even less abstract, our being towards corpses, which is our condition, as a way of imbuing meaning into life, is replaced with a being towards consumption, a hiding away of this disturbing reality principle. For the martyr, especially the martyr who is in search of martyrdom, or has accepted the possibility of martyrdom, such fears seem to be overcome. The repression of fear that has been sublimated and transformed into the joy of death. Zizek reminds us that these martyrs are not just committed to a cause, but rather the cause is their identity. There is no individual ego outside of the cause. So great is the amalgamation of being and cause. Thus, he argues, the cause is their, quote, engaged subjective position, unquote, which is often overlooked by focusing on mere commitments to causes, as if the cause is separate from the being. For the potential martyr, there is no separation. When looking to history, we see that there are three major forms of martyrdom. First, the victim martyrs. These are those who faithfully lived by a worldview, be it religious or secular, who were persecuted and murdered because of that worldview. In the Catholic Church, these comprise the bulk of the early martyrs, especially as they were murdered by anti-Christian forces in the Roman Empire. Nevertheless, this category would also include the early Muslim community persecuted by the Quraysh and others, and or later by the Crusaders. Socialists, Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, etc., living under fascist regimes, Yazidis living under the domination of ISIS. These are all victim martyrs. Second are the oppositional martyrs, or even revolutionary martyrs. These are those who did not seek their martyrdom, but nevertheless accepted it as a consequence of their identity and worldview that they were fighting for, either to protect or advance. Here we can include men like John Brown, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Fred Hampton, Che Guevara, etc. They did not seek martyrdom. Their emancipatory mission went well beyond their own deaths. They would rather have lived into old age and seen their mission triumphant. Nevertheless, they accepted the possibility of its realization. Death was realized. Both Imam Ali and Imam Hussein fall into this category. Lastly are the intentional martyrs. These are those who seek martyrdom because they are compelled by their engaged subjective position to do so. For martyrdom is intentionally integrated into their mission. This would include someone like Jesus of Nazareth and St. Francis. The former, according to the Christian tradition, sought martyrdom on the cross because it was the divinely mandated way to rescue and redeem humanity. The latter, St. Francis, actively sought martyrdom when he traveled to Egypt in AD 1219 during the Fourth Crusade, as he was convinced that his mission of peace between Muslims and Christians could end in no other way, as preaching Christ's love to Muslim heathens would eventually get him killed. Right? This was welcomed by St. Francis, as he wished to die like his Savior died at the hands of those who were hostile to Christ and the Christian message. However, of course, Francis found friendship with the Sultan Malik of Kamel, not death. Here we have three major models for martyrdom, but they are qualitatively different. While the last two involve some kind of contestation, a struggle within society, whether that be religious or secular, the first, the victim martyr, is persecuted simply for being non-identical, as Adorno described their reality as others living within ideologically strict identity contours. Their existence simply as something other than what ought to be homogeneous is their crime. Therefore, their crime is merely existing as another, and this otherness is the cause of their martyrdom. The third form of martyrdom, the intentional martyr, is rare in history. And here I don't include suicide bombers or anything like this. But revolutionaries, reformers, social activists rarely integrate their own death into their mission. Che Guevara did not seek martyrdom in Bolivia when he attempted to start a South American uprising against American colonialism. Neither did Oliver Cromwell, Thomas Müntzer, Karl Marx, John Brown, Vladimir Lenin, Leon Trotsky, or other revolutionaries fighting the American fascist regimes in Latin America in the 1980s, as Dr. Siebert talked about. While martyrdom came to many of these revolutionaries, it was not an integrated component into their mission or their strategy, but rather the consequence of being oppositional to the status quo. Most of the prophets of the Bible and the Quran fit this description. While many were eventually martyred, few actively sought martyrdom, but rather were prepared to accept it when it came. When studying martyrdom, we often hear the refrain that the martyr is more powerful dead than alive. While this is often accepted as a truism, we're often left simply with an empty slogan. What makes it true? While this may be true, it is rarely explained. Martyrdom is indeed a powerful tool in the hands of those who are in the deficient end of the power differential. In other words, the martyrdom of the revolutionary is a mobilizing passion that fuels continual struggle against unjust conditions. The memory of the revolutionary, no longer bound to the reality of physical existence, and therefore a much more pliable narrative, can galvanize the followers more powerfully than their actual speeches, strategies, and presence, especially since the unjustness of martyrdom is a mobilizing cause for revenge. Justice for the martyred existentially takes on a much bigger cause, for the martyred themselves are no longer capable of seeking just compensation for their death. The death of the martyr then assigns such a justice-seeking cause to the followers, who must prove themselves worthy of their fallen leader. They must demonstrate their fidelity to the fallen leader by successfully implementing the cause of the leader. In other words, as not to succumb to grief, pain, and the shame of losing the leader, of allowing them to fall at the hands of the unjust, the follower must risk their own martyrdom as a means of achieving the leader's vision. In this sense, the memory of the fallen may actually be a much more galvanizing force for the movement, not because the leader becomes mythological, as it is often explained, but rather that to achieve the goal of the leader is the only way to atone for the shame of allowing the leader to be martyred. This is certainly true in the case of Imam Hussein in the Shi'i tradition, and it took its distinctive characteristics in response to the need for tawbah, of repentance, for the death of Ashura in the month of Muharram. The shame of not protecting Imam Hussein, his family, and his companions, not responding to his call when he desperately needed it, could only be overcome historically through acts of repentance. During Ashura, such acts take the form of the passion plays, the chest beatings, the chain flagellation, sword flagellations, etc. Nevertheless, these individual acts of repentance, although done in groups, only alleviate the individual sense of shame, or maybe even only momentarily, for not being there to defend Imam Hussein, even if it happened 1400 years prior to their own existence. However, the collective guilt inherited within the Shi'i community for the martyrdom of Imam Hussein can only be addressed through the truly collective practice, a revolutionary attempt to realize the vision of Imam Hussein as inherited from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This mission was, of course, famously invoked by Ayatollah Khomeini and others during the revolutionary period in the late 1970s in Iran. Whether what followed the overthrow of the Peacock Throne was a realization of Imam Hussein's vision for the Muslim Ummah is certainly questionable. Nevertheless, the vision of Imam Hussein ought to remain a grand inquisitor to anyone claiming to have realized the vision of Imam Hussein in Prophet Muhammad. Returning to Ashura, what Walter Benjamin, the critical theorist, calls modern people's weak messianic power to redeem the victims of historical injustice isn't exercised by individual initiative, but rather it is a collective attempt to block such injustices from occurring again. To allow Ashura to repeat itself through the re-victimization of Imam Hussein, symbolically represented by the Muslim community, specifically the Shia, is to abandon the weak messianic power those of us who are still alive today are in possession of. For Benjamin, the contemporary cannot awake the dead. They cannot be fully redeemed. The dead cannot be fully redeemed by our initiative. Only God redeems the dead and consummates all of history, and only the Messiah acts as the agent of that redemption. Nevertheless, the martyrs, whether they were victims of tyranny or those who fought tyranny, cannot be forgotten by the living, nor can humanity simply wait for God to deliver us from evil. What Benjamin knew was that only stopping the conditions that perpetuate victimization within the contemporary moment delivers a semblance of redemption for the already martyred. Nevertheless, such contestation against the prevailing conditions of injustice inevitably leads to more martyrs, more innocent victims who need redemption through the still living historical actors. As such, to partially redeem the dead, there must be more dead. And that's the unfortunate dialectic of history and the dialectic of martyrdom. Lastly, Adorno once remarked that the roles of revolutionaries and martyrs have migrated from the religious sphere into the secular, especially in the West, wherein religious martyrdom appears wholly anachronistic, irrational, and nihilistic. The quote unquote martyrs the modern West are familiar with are nearly all seen as religious terrorists, those willing to attack modern society in an attempt to forward their medieval quote unquote or fanatical belief systems. That religious martyrs in the West continue to exist, such as John Brown, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Saint Maximilian Kolbe, Dr. Edith Stein, which was also known as Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, Saint Archbishop Oscar Romero, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, just to name a few. It's entirely outside of the cognitive understanding that these are religious martyrs from the West. The West no longer produces religious martyrs because the West is secular, it is thought. While it is true that revolutionary and or emancipatory change by and large has migrated to the secular realm, religious voices continue to be voices of resistance to opposition and injustice, albeit a minority of religious voices. Martyrs for emancipatory change in Western nations are overwhelmingly secular, especially in the 20th and 21st century West, wherein religion itself has been neutralized as a progressive social force and has retreated predominantly into the private sphere. Nevertheless, when progressive religious voices dare to step forward into the political and economic realm and register their protest against true injustice, they incur as much wrath as their secular counterparts, if not more, as religion is often seen in the West, especially in America, as a pattern maintenance subsystem or a way of cementing the status quo, not disturbing it. To reject the Constantinian form of Christianity, for example, and reconcile oneself to the socially destabilizing nature of the Gospels, one that rejects the aristocratic law of nature, capitalism, and other forms of social oppression, is to betray the Christian community and side with the secular and or non-Christian heathens. To do so in the name of a more just, equitable, and qualitatively freer society is to potentially join the martyrs mentioned above. Religion is to be looked at as a cultural good, not a force for change in the capitalistic West. Right? Its role in modern society is to bless, sanctify, and justify the already given society, especially its class structure and racial hierarchy, not to question such establishments and act against them. As such, the religious martyrs of the modern West are those who took the emancipatory claims of the religious tradition seriously, made it their identity, and paid the ultimate price for such.
Now the floor is for Professor Said Sajjad Rizvi.
Let me just maybe make a couple of points and then actually say something in defense of emotion. Quite simply because if anything, what we realized in the last couple of years is that emotion and the way in which affect works amongst us humans is a very powerful thing. And in particular, the way in which affect moves us to do things is a very powerful and significant thing. But before I come to that, let me just say a couple of things more generally. I'm sure these have been covered. You know, fundamentally, it seems to me that the lesson, I guess, of the Imams rising at Karbala is, of course, often encapsulated in a very important slogan, right? And that slogan, of course, is in Arabic, Hayhat minna adalla, right? So the idea of saying no to humiliation. And humiliation is, in this sense, understood as, you know, reducing a person to what is not fitting for their humanity, and reducing a person from what is not fitting to what they are. And against that is a very different conception of humanity. Against that is a conception of humanity which is about the possibility of becoming. It's, you know, at one level, it's about becoming, acquiring the virtues of God, for example, within the spiritual traditions. It's about truly becoming a custodian or guardian, a khalifa in the Quranic language, insofar as one can take control of oneself, but also that one can nurture one's environment, it can nurture one's community, not just develop and move in a particular vertical direction, but also take those around you and your context with you. So I think that conception of virtue, of good, flourishing living, which lies at the heart of the conception of humanity, is very important. And that concept of humanity is very closely tied to a very significant theme in the spiritual traditions, which of course is often known as, in the Greek term, as theosis, or in Arabic is ta'alluq, the idea of becoming godlike, as I said, acquiring the divine virtues. So standing against humiliation, standing against oppression, in many ways is about defending a particular conception of what it means to be human as well. And that's quite significant. So sometimes we think purely in terms of an opposition, we think purely in terms of the immediacy of political action, but there's more than that. It can't just be a negation. There has to be some sort of affirmation involved in that as well. And I think that's extremely significant. Now, tied to that is a very, very significant concept of freedom, right? So the rejection of humiliation, the rejection of oppression is predicated on, as I said, a conception of humanity, but also that one of the essential features of that humanity is freedom. That humans are created free. They have choices. They have choices to, for example, recognize God. They have choices to be grateful for what they have and what possibilities they have. They also have choices to reject that. And that freedom and acting in a free way in which you're unencumbered, not just unencumbered by external force against you, but also unencumbered by your own kind of selfish desires, and the way in which one's animality might lead oneself to. So the other, I guess, thing which might be a slogan, but it's not so much a slogan, it's a very famous saying of the Imam on the afternoon of Ashura. When towards the end he turns to the people opposite and says, even if you do not necessarily follow my beliefs, even though you may not share my beliefs, at least be free men, right? And so what is being suggested precisely is that make that free choice to act in conformity to what is your humanity. So the rejection, as I said, the rejection for me of humiliation, of oppression, of standing up for the rights of others has to be predicated on a certain conception of humanity and a certain conception of freedom, which ultimately tie one in to a spiritual account of what the human is, linked to God, on a constant journey from God and ever returning to God, right? The famous kalimat al-istirja' that is famously uttered whenever anyone dies, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. So that I think would be the two main points. And then finally, I actually have no idea how long I have, but I'm going to be quick because I'm sure that there is quite a lot which has happened and maybe there's discussion which will follow. On emotion and affect. So yes, I would to a certain extent agree that there is an element of performativity which happens in a lot of the rituals of Aza, regardless of what language it's articulated in. That performativity is not necessarily a bad thing, because that performativity also tells a certain story, and that story, that account, that narrative is something which is meaningful for people. So of course, if that narrative is not being conveyed, then that's perhaps a bit of a problem with the performativity, but that in itself for me is not problematic. But more generally, I think the whole idea of expressing grief, of expressing emotion, of linking together in some sort of communal feeling of that is a very powerful way of binding people together. When one is in that kind of emotional situation, it's much easier to be affected in a positive manner. It's when one is mourning oppression and the sheer terror of violence, that should, of course, have a very important way of alerting the self to the fact that that sheer terror of violence is something that one has to oppose and one should never be involved in, right? Now, of course, humans are not perfect beings, we know that. But all one can do is to express through that communality, that community feeling, that community emotion, ways that sort of underpin the positive virtues that you want to see coming out of that, the positive affirmations of humanity which come out of that, and that conception of humanity, which I think is extremely important. So, as I'm saying, it's about taking the negative with the positive, so having a negation of something, but also an affirmation of something, and really considering the human experience as something which is holistic. We are not disembodied minds. We are not mere discrete, atomistic, rational agents. We are people who are very much embodied. We live within the world. We have social relations with others within that world. And the makeup of the way in which we are motivated to act and how we think about things is about a lot more than just certain kinds of rational choices, certain kinds of social or political choices, but rather the human is much more than that. And it's very important not to forget that the human is a spiritual being, and that's if anything, that is perhaps the most important element of it, because it is the walaya of the Imam which is absolutely central to what is playing out in Karbala. It's why people joined him. It's why people fought for him. It's why people defended him and died for him. And we can't really. It's much more than a set of emotional commemorations. It's much more than a set of political and social actions. And I think I should stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sajjad. I enjoyed a lot. Thank you very much. Now the floor is for Professor Mahjabin. Dear sister, the floor is yours.
Greetings of peace, everyone. It was great listening to all of you and your fantastic presentations. I had a few points that I wanted to share, and so much has already been said, and I guess these are challenges of going last, perhaps, so everything is already spoken of, but I had a few points that I'd like to share with you. 3 points in general. There are, of course, some notes that I made listening to everyone, and maybe some responses to that, perhaps in the discussion session. But what I wanted to speak about was martyrdom through the lens of theology, the theological studies that we do with it, and of course, a little bit about the lament culture itself, the cultural affect that it carries, the message of Ashura. And of course, I couldn't sign off without speaking about the gendered aspect of it, and which is the main focus of my study. My studies and research are usually in the intersections of theology and women's studies. So these are the 3 points that I'd like to share with you. Very beautifully, things have already been sort of focused and centered. One of these aspects of martyrdom is what has allowed, I think, this message of Ashura to raise or to bring about something that had been oppressed or suppressed for a long time. So when we're talking about this term martyrdom, and it has been explained in so many different ways by the esteemed panelists over here, I think one of the things that martyrdom brings about is sort of forces open cases, or shall I call them cold cases of history that have been suppressed for a long time. So I read the martyrdom of Imam Hussein as something that blew the cover on so many things that had been pushed under the rug by Islamic historians. And it sort of forced that conversation out. And for us to have this roundtable discussion today is one of those proofs of how that is forced out. And we're talking about this even centuries after the episode has lapsed. So I think it holds in it all those questions about what was the Munafiqat movement or the hypocritics movement during the time of the Prophet? What was that first case of non-intimidation against the face of power? That case of Fatima Zahra versus the first caliph, and that is my current manuscript, which is being completed, is the sermon of Fatima, and one of the first cases of truth speaking to power, and that first voice comes as the voice of a Muslim woman. I'm not sure if you can all hear me or see me, so please give me a nod or a nudge if you can all hear me and see me. Okay, great, perfect.
Don't worry.
Yeah. Thank you. So I think this is what the martyrdom has done. It has sort of forced open all these cold cases and these conversations to come out. what happened between, the Alawid, Imam Ali's sort of political theory versus the political theory of the Umayyads. Shura, we talked about, there were so many things that came about. Shura came about, communal guilt or collective guilt. I think of martyrdom as a collective inspiration rather than a collective guilt. And also when we think about political theory, one of the things that I argue in my manuscript is about the theological implications on how we understand leadership of the masses. So to start off with that first point on the theological messages that we get in this martyrdom narrative is that adl, justice, can be served through a certain concept and a certain procedure, which needs to be studied theologically, at least for those who are connected to the spiritual traditions or religious traditions. So adliya as a theological thought was also something that was focusing on the minority experiences. Adl was rejected by the mainstream for the very reason of not having to impose something on God. But here we were imposing, not really imposing, but talking about one of the intrinsic principles that will serve liberation and freedom to all human beings, and that is justice. Justice studies have come into vogue right now, but this is something that the minorities, the Shia, the Mu'tazili, the Adliya movement had already subscribed to even in the 9th century. So it has this connection with theology. And from Adl force flows an understanding of leadership, which is a service-based leadership versus a power-enforced leadership. So we see these two models of leadership. There is a model where you gain power. We're not talking about the means of you gaining the power, but a party comes to power and enforces their presence on the masses. And opposed to that, you have a people-focused, principle-focused, service-based leadership where you are serving, you are leading through serving the minorities. And this is the model that has been portrayed in the leadership of the Prophet, in the leadership of Imam Ali, in the leadership of Imam Hussein, and for the 12 Shias, in the leadership of their Imam. So even though they were not on a seat of leadership, they were still leading people through service. And this service-based leadership is something I think I argue about, at least for the women's leadership in religion as well. Because when you look at service-based, it opens up a conversation about gender roles as well, which I want to keep for my gendered aspect. So this is the theological aspect, which I think is important, that comes up through martyrdom. It sort of forces open or brings into conversation all the cold cases that had been suppressed for a long time. And it gives us a model of leadership which is service-based, which gives voice to the knowledge produced in the margins. Yeah, and I think this is where the lament culture also comes in, the performance of pain, the embodying of a narrative. All of this is imbued in this culture that keeps changing from the people who relate this narrative, from their geographical locations, from their time. We find that this is so diverse and it includes so many voices. And for the longest of time, minorities have documented their histories through culture. So what was excluded or precluded from mainstream Islamic history got deposited in the cultural practices of minorities. We see this with African Americans. We see this with the studies of indigenous people, where and I think the Shia culture or the lament culture in particular, is one of those ways in which this history was documented by the margins and sort of sent forth to generations because they had no publication rights. Perhaps they were excluded from the formal means of spreading knowledge or formulating knowledge. So the lament culture, I think, is also very important. Just like Dr. Rizvi said before me, Sajjad Rizvi, is about embodying. We cannot be disembodied human beings, and sometimes what we embody stays with us more than what we engage with intellectually. And with the lack of those intellectuals, the means of intellectual propagation for the minorities, especially the Shia, most of that history had to be carried and continues to be carried in the form of a lament culture. It makes a message out of the massacre, so when you look at it, now it becomes a message. It takes a tragedy and forces it into a reverse trajectory where you go back and you see where this started, what were the principles, what were the factors, and then we can unpack that. The third aspect that I wanted to talk about is, of course, the gendered aspect. And this is, of course, very close, not just to my own lived experience, but also to my studies, to my research. And my very first research for my dissertation was on the sermon of Hazrat Fatima. And I looked at her sermon as a theologically inspired scholar activist. Right? Which I realize is a very loaded term. The term scholar itself needs to be understood in so many different contexts. And then the term activist, and then those two put together, scholar activist, a term that the Enlightenment movement claims as its own production, I argue that was already being embodied even before the Enlightenment movement. So when I look at the gendered aspect, I find it really hard to come to terms with, even in this modern day and age, in 2021, when I see people on the cultural platform or on the spiritual platform talking about the women in Karbala, or talking about women in general in Islam, still speaking about gender roles as, leadership belonging to the male and caregiving belonging to the female. This seems to be the common rhetoric that goes around sort of defining those gender roles. And I argue that this cannot be substantiated or subscribed to by theological studies, especially from the Quran. Because if we look at the Quran talks about human virtues as being gender inclusive. So if caregiving is a human virtue, then it is equally accessible to all genders. And if leadership is a human virtue, then it is something that is open to all genders. So to categorize leadership for men and caregiving for women, I think takes away all those narratives of the Prophet as a caregiver, Imam Ali as a caregiver. Imam Hussein, the very first thing that he did when he arrived in Karbala was to make sure that the women and children were taken care of and their encampments were comfortably set up before they could take care of other business. So if you're going to say that caregiving is only a female gendered role, then you're taking away all these caregiving narratives that we have from the male proponents of justice. And if you're going to say that leadership befits men, or is a peculiar characteristic for the male gender, then you're going to take away the very first female scholar activist, and that is Fatima Zahra. 10 days after the Prophet's demise, she stands in front of the political power of her time and says with perfect confidence, "Where is it in the book of God that you may inherit your father and I may not inherit mine?" So for an 18-year-old or a 23-year-old, however, a young adult woman to have that confidence in her theology and her understanding of the sacred text and come out in public and say this to the political authority is for me a very prime example of what a social activist or a scholar activist looks like, or somebody working for justice looks like. So if we're going to, keep advancing these segregated gender roles, then we're going to take away from these narratives. What are we going to do with the narrative of Zainab, who is by all means the leader of the captives? She is the leader of a broken community. you know, and she brings this very safely back to Medina, where Imam Sajjad can then, you know, he's of course the Imam of the time throughout, but the leadership roles are being enacted here or embodied here by Zainab, and I don't think we can discount that at all, or we can take away from that narrative. So if this gendered aspect of martyrdom is not translated or conveyed or spoken of, we always speak about the courage of a martyr, you know, of a warrior who bids goodbye and goes to the plane of his martyrdom. But to each man is attached several women. And even though the struggle of the man lasts for maybe those couple of hours, or, you know, that time that they spend facing death, the courage of the women associated in their lives will be required for a far longer time, and their struggle will go on for a longer time. So I think there are these nuances about martyrdom, about gender roles that are intertwined in this saga of Ashura, which are usually brushed aside or very quickly made notes of, and we see that till today, you know, very few women are board of trustees in Islamic centers, or you know, in other sort of leadership positions, and this is something that I argue for through this martyrdom lens. Lastly, I just want to say that there is a universal appeal into this martyrdom saga of Ashura, and among those several universal appeals, I would like to concentrate on the affirmative action aspect. As you know, the term affirmative action is a political term, is a term that was used by law in 1961 in the John F. Kennedy case, to be able to uplift the voices of the minorities. Once you have proof of the subjugation of minorities, and if you want to serve justice in the current or contemporary era, you would resort to affirmative action. This is what is usually, you know, when you keep seats for racial minorities or sexual minorities or gendered minorities in the parliament, in universities, in large corporations, this is how they serve justice through affirmative action. So I would like to see that affirmative action, at least in academia. I am here on the West Coast, so I'm signing in today from San Jose. I teach in Berkeley. So on the West Coast, who is studying Shia studies? If there are students who want to learn more about the minority experiences of the Shia, the knowledge produced in these margins, or to have these conversations, what course are they going to take? Where are they going to go? Who are the people who are doing the research? I know that there are some studies happening on the East Coast. Of course, in England and the UK, I know that this flourishes as well. But on the West Coast, there's hardly anyone doing these. After Professor Hamid Algar retired, there was nobody else who has taken up this. And there was this huge void of that platform or that place where these discussions can happen in a research-based environment or in a scholarly environment. So I think if through this saga of martyrdom, if there is an affirmative action that could be inspired, then it would be to do something about these studies, especially in the West Coast. There are a few voices. Of course, there's Hamid Mawani in the South Bay. I try to do what I'm doing here in the North Bay, but I think we could use a platform, where we can actually have these studies and have these conversations at a larger level. So I think that those are my thoughts that I had prepared. Thank you for giving me your time and listening to me, and I look forward to our discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was really joyful to listen to you. Thank you very much. So, I am the last, I think, presenter, and I assure you that I will make it very short, not more than a few minutes. I was thinking about Ashura and how to understand it. I think Farid mentioned something about sectarianism, and I was thinking along those lines as well. How could we understand the relevance of Ashura or the movement of Imam Hussein for Muslim world today, now and here? Is it possible to understand the move of Imam Hussein or the movement of Imam Hussein as a relevant paradigm for today's Muslim predicament? Some may argue that, Imam Hussein was living 1,000 something 400 years ago, and that kind of society doesn't exist now, and those kind of problems that Muslims may have encountered today, we are not actually encountering. But I don't know, maybe somehow it seems very weird that those kind of issues which were relevant during Imam Hussein's time, somehow in a different maybe form and shapes, are with us today. And as other contributors and speakers actually rightly mentioned, when we are thinking about the movement of Imam Hussein and the act of Imam Hussein in Ashura, we can understand it at different levels. For example, Sufis have looked at it in their own way. Mystics, they have interpreted in a different way. Philosophers try to contemplate on that. Maybe, for example, jurisprudential approach has produced a body of knowledge, and there are different levels: theological, philosophical, sociological, political, and even historical. There are controversies even up to this very day. But there are three issues I have tried to actually refer to, and it seems those three issues which led to the Ashura and the movement of Imam Hussein is still with us. The first one, I think, is the question of transition of power. We see that when, for example, the Shahada or the martyrdom of Imam Ali happens, then Imam Hassan becomes the ruler or the caliph of Muslim Ummah. We see the move by Muawiyah, and after that, the transformation of the body politic into some kind of dynastical paradigm. And then we see that the transition of power becomes a very, very significant issue among Muslims from the very day that it is established. And even today, right now we are talking, when we look at, for example, Muslim world, it doesn't matter, it is a Shiite or it is a Sunni. We see that we have still an issue about the transition of power. If, for example, the constituency is not happy with the form of government or with the form of, for example, rules, how can they change or how can they transform power? And the second issue, which I think the movement of Imam Hussein shows or demonstrates, is the relation between power and elites and the people. Say, for example, if some elites, it doesn't matter, intellectual, political, religious elites, are not happy with the power, with the existing power, how can they get across their understanding, their opinions, without, as Sajjad rightly mentioned, without getting humiliated, without getting massacred, without getting suppressed? Is there a way to reformulate or try to reconstruct a system where, when you are not happy or when you have different opinions, when you utter and express your opinions, you don't get suppressed, oppressed, or killed. This is the second issue which we see the movement of Imam Hussein actually try to address and still is with us. We haven't found a way to get across or get over that problematic. And I think the third issue, which is still with us and will be with us, is the question of Islah Dini, or religious reform, or reform in acts, actions, structures, or the beliefs which are ascribed to religion, but somehow actually are working against the religion as such. And we see that when Imam Hussein is trying to leave Medina, and many people come to him, and some of them, or maybe most of them, are actually trying to be kind to him and trying to actually advise him not to leave Medina and take the oath of allegiance to Yazid. And he says, Inni lam akhruju ashiran, wala batran, wala mufsidan, wala zaliman, wa innama kharajtu li talabi islah fi ummati jaddi. I'm not actually coming out. It seems there is an atmosphere and the power structures and the government or the regime in that time has tried to portray Imam Hussein and the house of Prophet Muhammad as some person or some people who are trying to go against the government because they are somehow like rogue people, or they are trying to like corrupt society, or they are actually trying to exercise injustice on people. He says, no, none of these things. Actually, I'm trying to step on Islah, reform of the religion which Prophet Muhammad brought. And it seems the question of Islah, or the question of reform, is another aspect of Ashura. And today, again, we are faced, for example, with some kind of belief, some kind of, for example, understanding, some kind of constructions of what is religion and what religion is trying to achieve. And there are many, quote unquote, for example, superstitions which are ascribed to religion, but it doesn't have anything to do with the essence of religion, at least as far as the question of ubudiyya to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it seems these three dimensions or these three elements of Ashura still is with us, and still it could act, or it could be a source of inspiration in order to emancipate, or in order to be at the service of emancipation of human agency and human person. And in this sense, I don't think it's only as far as the concept of emancipation is concerned, it's only something just related to Shia Muslims or related to the Islamic society, but it could actually have a worldwide and universal significance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brother Syed. It was most excellent. So now we're gonna move into questions. So if anyone has questions for anyone else, then feel free to unmute yourself and ask away.
Actually, I'd like to ask something.
Yes.
I think Professor Siebert was speaking actually, but he was muted, so we couldn't hear him. I think he was saying something before I did.
He's muted.
Yeah.
You
Professor
have to
Siebert, you have.
unmute.
Oh, no, now he's, okay.
Now, well, you first.
Oh, all right. Thank you. I have a general question, not so, not really specific to anyone. But before that, I just wanted to very quickly say that, I was very interested with a point made by Professor Siebert when he said that Jesus knew that the revolution was lost, and I think that is the same. That also goes for Imam Hussein. He knew that the revolution was lost, but the point was actually to lose it, because had he not engaged in those acts, and if he was not, if he had not stood up to to power, then the consequences for Muslims would have been terrible, right? At one level, as I said in my talk, at one level, it really doesn't matter. The significance of his martyrdom had not to do with whether he was the grandson of the Prophet or not. It was an act of a human being. But at another level, him being the grandson of the Prophet was very important. Him being a key member of the Ahlul Bayt, of the Ahlul Kisa, was so important, because had he not engaged in that act, what would history say? Until today, what would we say about how this member of the Ahlul Bayt gave the oath of allegiance to Yazid? But it seems to me fascinating to actually compare Jesus and Hussein, both in terms of our interest in Islamic history, but also when it comes to comparative religion and interreligious dialogue. The significance for interreligious dialogue, I think, would be very interesting. But my comment actually is on this issue of inspiration. We speak a lot about the power of history, and in this case, Karbala, Ashura, the martyrdom, the power that has to inspire us. But see, my question is this: isn't it true that history, and in this particular case, the history of Karbala, has actually failed to inspire us? Dr. Mahjabin was speaking about Fatima to Zahra and Zainab. I mean, there you have a good example of how these great personalities have actually failed to inspire us. We remain, especially in the Middle East, probably more so than my part of the world, but even my part of the world, the Malay world, Malaysia, Indonesia, remain thoroughly patriarchal. And the modernist Islamic movements are probably more misogynist than the more traditionalist. So this is, they're products of the modern world, of modernity. And there is that utter failure to be inspired by the great personalities of the past, by the historical events of the past. And I think this is something that needs to be examined. In the case of Sunnis, I'm pretty sure that the failure to be inspired by the past has a lot to do with the covering up of history. So, for example, the historical amnesia that I referred to with regard to Karbala. But I'm wondering whether, with regard to Shiites, it may have to do with the level of performativity. It seems to me, perhaps, it's possible to say that the greater the level of performativity, the lesser the inspiration. The emotions that the immediate emotions that are evoked by the performativity are very much then and there, and then they quickly dissipate, and they are no longer available to inspire. So I think perhaps, the question is, what is the function of martyrdom, of that martyrdom of Karbala today? Does it have a function, not a function that we wish it should have, but a function that it has in actual reality? What is that function?
Yes, go on, Mehdi. I had something to say as well, but you go on first. No, you go on first. You are the boss.
Oh, no.
You have to unmute.
You can go ahead.
You are the boss.
Yeah. But anyway, I think if we were to look at martyrdom as being present and being witness, and it means in terms of social responsibility, I'm present, I'm witness, I'm reflecting, and therefore I have to act. Therefore, that is not limited to a particular time and space. That has to continue in order to fulfill the mission. That is, martyrdom is designed for emancipation and ultimately for freedom. Okay? I mean, if we define martyrdom as such, then yes, it is not, even though you lose the battle, but you continue to fight, because ultimately the goal is to win the war. And the war that is that we have inherited from the time of Adam and the children of Adam, Cain and Abel. And so in that sense, I think martyrdom gives us the social responsibility, and that goes across time and space. I don't see how Ashura could be one day in a particular history, but to me, it seems as an endless day across time and space. Anyways, it sounds like very idealistic, I understand, but also let me just say this, that the consumption of that history has done the most damage to the entire process of that history. The sensationalist, the most exaggerated, bizarre story that is associated with Karbala. I mean, it is hard to imagine that somebody could come up with that level of exaggeration and sensationalist, portrayal of the event. Like Hussein's brother Abul Fazl Abbas had his arms cut off, yet he managed to take a sword in his hand and kill hundreds of the soldiers. I mean, that's just, it defies logic. It defies any kind of thinking really at any level. And so I think that the consumption of history is tied up pretty much to the socioeconomic and political structure of current reality. And that's why it's been covered up throughout history. And that's why I think when we say that martyrdom is the resurrection, it is the dusting of the event in order to reveal the true nature or the truth of the event, then of course we can see that the abuses of power by the existing, groups in power, we see it all over the world, and that's the reason really for Ashura missing its mark. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Can I just quickly say,
Yeah,
I appreciate what you said. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I just want to say about one thing you mentioned is about that. Does it like Karbala inspires us, or no, it has failed to inspire us? I'm thinking about, maybe we can say periodically it inspired us. For example, when we look at the Iranian Revolution and what Shariati says about, for example, institution and movement, when Shiism or the discourse on Shiism is like a movement, it actually inspires and even brought women, when we think about the gender question, brought women to the public square. But when Shiism started to establish itself and became like the institution, or the discourse of Shiism became like institutionalized, it slowly stopped to inspire as far as the public square is concerned. And it went more into what the Sajjad calls performative aspect or dimensions of Ashura. So I think we have to a little bit look at the discourse of Shiism or Ashura when it is institutionalized and when it is at the level of a movement. Sorry.
I think that's a really good point, and I can just put it in other terms, saying the same thing, that we have to make a distinction between Ashura in utopian terms and Ashura in ideological terms. So before the revolution, it's part of a utopian orientation. After the revolution, after power is captured, state power is captured, then it becomes it functions. It has an ideological function to numb the the mind to
co-op, yeah.
Co-opt, yes,
Co-optation,
exactly.
yeah.
But I was also going to respond to, or just to pick up on what you said about Abu Faz. I think Muslims are among the last to actually seriously critique and reconstruct our history.
Thank you.
There's so much of myth in history which is taken as fact, right? So the critical tools that we have available to us, both from modern historical scholarship, as well as, for example, Ibn Khaldun, which provides a very critical method for the study of history, have not really been applied. So Ibn Khaldun himself had hardly any followers. He never, his work did not result in a school of thought, and you don't have after 1,500 years, you don't have a critical tradition of historical studies among Muslims. So many things, even which have to do with the history, the seerah, or the history of the Prophet, his life, are taken for granted, which are unlikely to have happened. And if we accept them to have happened, I think they constitute a blemish on our history. For example, the story that the Prophet agreed to the execution of a whole tribe of Jews, the Bani Qurayza, and agreed that their family, wife and children be sold as slaves. This is a fantastic. So the Prophet agreed to collective punishment for the possible crimes of a handful of the men of the Bani Qurayza. This is simply accepted as historical fact and taught. So much so that a Russian ISIS fighter said, this was a few years ago, he was telling the Muslims, "Why are you so critical of us for killing Christians? Look at what the Prophet did. He killed all these. He killed the whole Jewish tribe. So what we are doing is not anything different." So I think we really need to be more critical about history.
I think there are quite a few who have taken that. We still continue to reconsider, perhaps to have a historiography that is more honest. And also we've learned better techniques of perhaps looking at whatever is left from that period, be it in written form, artifacts, geography, racial, ethnic characteristics. But you're absolutely right. We still need to do it. I think that's what Shariati did, that he questioned just about every concept. And that's why the concept of martyrdom, when he introduces it, it means bearing witness, being alive in history, being a witness to history, being witness to atrocities committed in the name of God, religion, etc., in order to support a particular socioeconomic groups. And so to have a group, sense of belonging, a feeling, asaba, ta'assub, when it comes to Hussein and Ashura is fine, but let's not forget that sadly that is good only for that few days. And beyond that, they're at each other's throat. And that's the sad reality of it, because when we limit, we introduce it to sort of a collective emotional expression of anger and fear or regret, a historiography of regret really altogether, or sensation, then we lose sight of the fact that that wasn't an event for that period. I wasn't there, I couldn't help, but what I can do is to get the message, and maybe I can help my community. That's really, only if we take that from the event of Ashura and Martyrdom, then maybe there is hope for us. Thank you.
And you know,
I'm wondering
Mahdi,
if I can interject just for
Yeah, please.
yeah, may I? Only because I need to leave, and I think I shall miss most of the discussion. So if you allow me, if I can just make a little bit of a comment to the discussion, and I'm sure that'll be, you know, it'll continue, and I'll miss the later part of it.
Yes, please.
So
go on.
I just wanted to sort of arguing for the value of performativity in the discourse that we are currently engaged in. As the earlier professor, I think Professor Alatas, you know, the notion of perhaps the performativity has taken away from the inspiration. I don't think it's as simple as that. I think the performativity of it might be lending quite a bit to the inspiration aspect, but if it's not translating to the kind of desired result that we want to see in our communities and our cultures, then that sort of evokes several other connectivity questions. And I don't think it's as simple to say that, oh, because we are concentrating too much on the performance of the history, that we are missing out on the inspirational aspects of the history. So I think it's a larger discussion, and it can't really be simplified in that manner. And also, I think for, again, arguing for the value of the lament culture and, you know, the performative aspect of it, what I feel is that it at least ensures that those key inspirational factors at least lie benign in that narrative for perhaps an audience or those actors who can extricate them and then animate them in their societies. But to say that we totally get rid of them because they're not serving the purpose of inspiration, I think would be losing out on the benign aspect of it as well. So I think they save those inspirational key factors in their performance, yes, but it's another job to actually translate them into the situation of our contemporary issues and then animate those factors to bring about the kind of affect that we want to see in our societies, in our academic research, in you know, and things like that. And to look at those performances as authentic resources of history is of course questionable, because when you're adding a performance aspect or an aesthetic aspect to a historical rendition, you are absolutely saying that it has been modified to bring it down to a public level and to engage in a historical, whether this is right or not right, or myth, or on that level would not be the right place, I think, to do that kind of analysis. Of course, we should be critical about history. We should be critical about what is narrated, what happened, what did not really happen. But that is more of a research base going down to the primary resources of the written documents that we have, to engage with the performative aspect of it and say, oh, this has been amplified. Of course, it's been amplified. That is why it is a performative action. And that is why we have these movies that are created by the Islamic Republic in Iran, the prophet stories, you know, the Karbala stories, and they are absolute exaggerations, but they're meant to be exaggerations because they are targeting a different kind of an audience and not really a research-based audience. So just in defense of the value that performativity might hold for us, and I think for the larger public, is important. And we see this resonating with counter-storytelling of critical race theory. We see this resonating with the rap culture of the African-American diaspora, of how this is used to make sure that those active nodes or those growing nodes of a narrative remain alive albeit benign within that performance, but they remain alive. Just wanted to say that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
If I may just
Thank you very much.
say one thing.
Absolutely.
The problem I have with that, collective expression of grief is that we limit the whole process, the whole event, the whole history to that. That's the problem I have. And of course, the abuses of that by charlatans out there who make money off of that.
Yeah.
Who have a very comfortable life at the expense of these weeping crowd. You see, that's the problem I have. I don't have any problem with that, a collective expression. I think, like you said, you pointed out, every culture has that. Every culture has that. I mean, Israelites, African Americans still, recall the story of Exodus, relating to that. Certainly, all of those things are relevant. We are human beings, multidimensional. But my point is, let's not limit to that alone, and let's move beyond that and see what is it that we can do. Let's have a balance of emotions and rational thought, in terms of our society. Sorry, but
I agree with Mehdi. I don't think we are against performativity. There's nothing wrong with that.
No.
But as you said, the abuse of it. And the other thing is, at least in the Shiite communities that I'm familiar with, Karbala or Imam Hussein only comes around once a year, and it's forgotten about for the rest of the year.
Right.
And the same people who are involved in Ashura and in commemoration for the rest of the year, in between Ashuras, are involved in all kinds of suspect activities, including a sectarian strife and all kinds of things. So that there is a failure to be inspired. To me, that's the problem. Not against performativity, but and we can speak about the ability to inspire as something we strive for. But my question is, in reality, why is that that inspiration? Why has it not succeeded to inspire? It's obviously something that we are not doing to relive these values, or to implement these values, and part of it has to do with the larger Muslim community, with the Sunni community, which has really forgotten about Hussein. And worse still, mentioning Hussein, mentioning Karbala means you are Shiite. So they brand you as Shiite, or brand you as pro
heretic.
Yeah, that's right. So
that's something I was going to talk about, is that this issue of looking back at Karbala and finding meaning and significance and inspiration in it is also subject to sectarianism, right? Here in the West, I'm in Michigan, and there are more masjids in Michigan than there are in the rest of the country. I swear, they're all over the place. But if you were to go to, say, in Kalamazoo, the largest of the mosques here, and you were to say something about Karbala, you would almost immediately hear the word followed up by another word, bid'ah, right? That all of Shiism is bid'ah. It's just a deviant path, right? And so the discourse about Karbala and about the martyrdom of Hussein and everything, it's just completely shut off. Right. And there's this, okay, well, what do you say about Imam Hussein? Well, he was a good person. It might have been unfortunate, but clearly this is how God wanted it to be, because Sunni Islam is the correct Islam, right? And so, I almost had the exact same thing from a Shia cleric in Dearborn when I visited him, and I asked him about Karbala, and he said it's riffraff religion. Now, he doesn't mean, of course, the martyrdom of Hussein is riffraff religion, but he means how people commemorate it is riffraff. Like, this has nothing to do with it, right? The popular, again, whether it's performative or not, but the popular remembrance of Imam Hussein is completely made up, and it's not really Islam. And that was coming from a very highly respected cleric in Dearborn, Michigan, coming from a long line of clerics in Iraq, right? And so there's already some kind of resistance to looking back at Karbala, looking at the martyrdom of Hussein for maybe different reasons. I think for the Sunni tradition, I think it's a deep-seated source of guilt, right? That we did something wrong here. And, you know, because of how history developed with the antagonism between the Sunnis and Shia, there's no way we can admit to that. So we'd rather just call it bid'ah or leave it behind, right? And that.
But Dustin, can I just quickly interject there? I think if you look at Sunni tradition, it isn't like that. You do Imam Hussein, Imam Hassan, Imam Ali, all the Ahl al-Qissa are integral to Sunni tradition.
Sure.
And Sunnis accept the same, more or less the same versions, or almost identical versions of the riwayat, of the hadith, concerning the Ahl al-Qissa, concerning the hadith Thaqalain, and all the relevant traditions. I think a lot of the Sunni views that we hear that indifferent or hostile to Shiism in general, and to the Ahl al-Bayt in particular, really are a result of Salafi influence. What I believe is, in the last decades, particularly the last 20 to 30 years, there's been a gradual Salafization of Sunni Islam, which occurs at two levels. One is Sunnis consciously becoming Salafi, but at the other level, which is I think the majority, you have Sunnis who are adopting Salafi ideas without realizing it. They're being taught certain ways. You know, for example, they are taught that practicing the Mawlid of the Prophet is a bid'ah. They don't know it's Salafi, but they think that their practices all this while had been wrong, and now they are learning the true Islam, not realizing that it's a different tradition, a minority tradition, historically a minority tradition within Islam. They don't realize that. So I think this is also the role of Salafization, the role of Salafism is, it's very important in terms of, affecting Sunni thought, which also has an impact on sectarianism.
Sure, and that's precisely the situation, at least from what I've experienced here, and just in the city of Kalamazoo, with the main, large masjid, wherein, there's no decorations, no nothing, because if you ask, why isn't the Quran written up here, they would say, well, that's the Sufis and that's the Shia that do that. Sunnis don't do that, right? And I mean, in the Shia students who are always there, always had to remain silent and live under this, like you said, the Salafi interpretation that was predominant in the masjid until they opened up their own masjid just, a block away from Dr. Siebert's house, right? And then there's another Sunni masjid on the other side of town that says this very thing. We want to escape that Salafi influence. But, I think you're right. With the rise, especially from the 1980s onwards here in the West, so much of our Islamic education is funded by the Gulf states. So much so that any talk of the Shia is, again, like I said, in a masjid is immediately called bid'ah. I learned about the Shia at the university, not in the masjid.
I heard one Sunni clergy on TV referring to Muawiyah as Hazrati Muawiyah, highest, title we use for Hazrat Ali, Hazrat Hussein, Hazrat Muawiyah. And I think you're right, Farid, that's the Salafi info. But also, let's not forget that there is a history that is constantly reminding certain groups, like in Iran, for instance, we're told that the Safavid dynasty massacred thousands, if not millions, of Sunni Iranians. The Shia state, Safavi state, which took Shiism as the official ideology, in other words, took Shiism and institutionalized it and massacred, all of those Sunnis. And so that is alive and well. There is a vivid memory. There is a collective memory there. And I think that in other parts also, there is, again, let's not forget that maintaining what they believe is their sacred, religion is tied very much to their economic class, their political economy, and their relation to the rest of the world.
Well, since no one is saying anything, I can also just further add to the discussion. Mehdi was talking about Shariati. I also, I didn't have the time to talk about Shariati, but now I can say that, this well-known distinction that Shariati made between Tashayyu Alawi and Tashayyu Safavi. It's interesting that the late Ottoman thinker Said Nursi, Badi'u Zaman Said Nursi, he made the distinction between he was Sunni, but he was, he talks a great deal about the Ahl al-Bayt, and he made the distinction between the Khilafati Shiites and the Wilayati Shiites. He was sympathetic to the Wilayati Shiites, but not the Khilafati Shiites, who, in other words, whom he thought as those who politicized Shiism and were interested in political rule. So I think there's some overlap between his notion of Wilayati Shiites and Shariati's notion of Tashayyu Alawi. And perhaps also a similarity or overlap between Tashayyu Safavi and the Khilafati Shiites, which we talked about. So I think a dialogue that we could create between the ideas of Shariati, a major 20th century Shiite thinker on the one hand, and Said Nursi, a major early 20th century Sunni thinker on the other hand, would be quite interesting in terms of as far as intra-Muslim dialogue is concerned.
Yeah. Iqbal Lahori has wonderful things to say about Imam Hussein, yet he was a Sunni. And of course, he was introduced to Iran by Shariati. Yeah. So at the higher level, really, of discourse, those things do not occur. Even if there is differences in opinion regarding a history, different reading of that history, that doesn't translate into a sort of a violent reaction that doesn't part of the masses. And that's the unfortunate part of it. That's what has been abused. That's what has been used by power, for people in power to take advantage, right, to fulfill their own interest or pursue their own interests.
Did we lose our dear brother Syed?
Syed left? Yeah.
Maybe. If he comes back, I'll let him in.
Maybe power.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we can all agree on is just how powerful martyrdom can be in social movements, social emancipatory movements. You think about early Christianity, and I'm getting in the realm of Rudy, and he can talk more on this than I can, but just how powerful it was as the Roman Empire would persecute Christians, how one martyr led to conversions, which led to more conversions and more martyrs and more conversions, right? And that's something that I think, at least in the contemporary West, as I was trying to get to in my paper, because we're secular, that looks completely irrational. Yet it's part of the Western history as well, the religious martyrs, right? It certainly happens here, and it continues to happen, even though it happens in places maybe not in America so much, but in Latin America, for instance. But that, I think, is in the history of religions, one of the most important driving forces in their growth is the persecution and the production of martyrs, right? Maybe Rudy can speak more on that one than I can. You have to unmute there, Rudy. Hey, Rudy, you're still muted.
Yes,
there you go.
I'm still muted. What happens to me?
Somebody does it to you.
Yeah, I know. For a moment, I would like to return to the present, and that means to Dustin and what he had to say about the Taliban and what is happening now. Obviously, the Taliban produced a lot of martyrdom in their struggle against the Soviet Union and then against the United States and NATO. And so there was martyrdom. And in a certain sense, we can say it was also revolutionary. But was it really revolutionary, or was it counter-revolutionary? Because it seems to me that the first attack of the Taliban against the Soviet Union was against the newer type of modern enlightenment and revolution, namely the socialistic one, the Marxist one, or the Marxist-Leninist one. And then secondly, they turned against the later bourgeois enlightenment and revolution. So as if it was almost planned, and there was talk about this, to take on the first part of modernity, the second part of modernity first, and then the first part secondly. And now it has succeeded. Now, can we say that the Taliban revolution and maybe even all Near Eastern revolutions are all counter-revolutions? And counter-revolutions who also have to be understood then, of course, in their theological core. I think the West is blind for these theological contents which are behind these counter-revolutions, even as far as ISIS is concerned. I think one should even listen to theological statements of ISIS, no matter how peculiar they may sound. So I think that this martyrdom and these revolutions or counter-revolutions are religiously motivated, are theologically motivated. But am I right to say that they are really fundamentally counter-revolutions against the West, against two parts of the West, namely the earlier bourgeois revolutions, and secondly, the socialistic revolutions which follow them?
Well, was the invasion of Iraq a postponed revolution, or you know what I mean? Invasion of Soviet Union, invasion of Afghanistan by Soviet Union. That was to stop a revolution.
Well, I would say that they were continuations of revolutions. I think the American attack against Afghanistan and Iraq and so on, that these were attempts to impose the results of the bourgeois revolution on these territories.
You're right, but one could also look at that there was a revolution brewing in Iraq, that invasion put an end to it, put a stop to it. Yes. In other words, then it became sort of, it led to sectarianism and all the violence that followed, because there was really, collectively, they lost direction, sort of, as to how to accomplish. That's my take on that. I think that with the greatest damage, the U.S. invasion of Iraq was not the material damage, it was the postponement of revolution that was in the making.
You mean a genuine revolution, not a counter?
Right, by the people, right. Against Saddam, right, against Saddam. The American invasion in many ways stopped or destroyed that process.
Right.
Same for Afghanistan, really. I don't know. I mean, let's not forget, that there is an element of nationalism involved here. In the case of Afghanistan, certainly tribal, sense of belonging and privilege, prestige, or identity associated with each tribe, the Pashtun, the Daris, the Hazaras, and on and on. I guess others, I don't know. I'm speculating because I've been thinking about this whole process of, Afghanistan. Why is there's an endless war going on and nobody seems to be able to at least stop it? The 20-year that appeared to be tranquil, was it really tranquil? I mean, look at all the murders that occurred in that 20 years, all the changes that occurred that really didn't benefit the Afghan society. I think Sayyid has something to say.
I think as far as Afghanistan is concerned, we have to take into consideration the geopolitics of this region as well. This is, I think, we are going to talk about that tomorrow. If you are interested, we have a meeting tomorrow. I'll send you the details about that. But I just want to say something about what Farid actually mentioned about the inspiration. Why, for example, Ashura has seeded in somehow to inspire us. I was thinking about, the way historically, or at least the majority or the most interpretations which have been constructed and reconstructed as far as Ashura is concerned, itself puts some kind of limits in how and in what way we can employ this paradigm of Ashura as a source of inspiration or as a form of emancipation. I think this movement has been constructed mainly as a military. I mean, its military nature has been signified. But when we look at, for example, the narrative or the historical background of what Imam Hussein has done, the military nature is not the prime or the primary issue or component of Ashura. For example, when we look at the way Imam Hussein is leaving Mecca and coming towards, for example, Kufa, he's taking all his relatives, children, women. And when you go, I mean, for example, if you have a very small amount of understanding of Arab society, when they want to go to a battle, how did they do, for example, prepare the battle? You don't take children, women, like old people with you in order to go to a battle. So it seems this movement or of Ashura has been belittled at the expense of what has been constructed as a military significance. For example, as far as the military inspiration or the battle kind of inspiration, we see it has inspired during 8 years' war between Iran and Iraq. It has been a source of inspiration, and the language and the concept used in order to strengthen or in order to actually inspire people to do the war. And even today, when we look at, for example, Hezbollah in Lebanon, we see Ashura is actually giving a very strong source of inspiration in order to stand in front of, for example, foreigners or in front of Israel as an incursive or as a like oppressor. So it feeding that form of inspiration that Ashura is a form of military or chivalrous, for example, form of being. But that reform aspect of it has been belittled. And I just add this as well. There was I think Mehdi actually alluded to that. There was this discourse on how to understand or reconceptualize Ashura. It was in that book written by the Iranian scholar. His name was Salehi Najafabadi. He talked about eternal martyr. And there he tried to actually bring that unsaid aspect of Ashura narrative, where this was a form of reformative move, not, for example, a military or other form of narratives which have prevailed in the Muslim world. So I think, I mean, if I add, it's like we are using Ashura in a selective form. We are picking what we need and we are putting aside the other aspects of this narrative.
So to put it in terms of suggested by Professor Siebert, you have both the counter-revolutionary, the possibility of a counter-revolutionary or a revolutionary use of Karbala, of Ashura. To put in Mannheim's terms, utopian, you have the possibility of a utopian or an ideological use of Karbala. Yes. So what that means is that we need to have more sociological type studies about commemoration and use and deployment of Ashura among contemporary Muslim movements, scholars, movements, activists. Like in the case of Lebanon, it is this Hassan Nasrallah, isn't it? He is maybe the most effective in terms of using Karbala to mobilize, but it's only used to mobilize against, if I'm not mistaken, you can correct me if I'm wrong, it's only used to mobilize against infidels, non-Muslims, but not against Muslims, and certainly not against Shiites. Not against, for example, despotic Shiite ideas or personalities or individuals or even states or organizations. So
no, they need the
very
money.
Selective in that sense. Yeah, that's right.
Which was very different than
yeah.
Ayatollah Khomeini, who
Yeah.
talked about, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi Shah as the new Yazid.
Yeah. So yeah, you're right, Sayed. Every time, or everybody, I think, alluded to the fact that we have a military, we look at the military dimension of Ashura and Karbala, and not the message. And also, to speak of martyrdom doesn't mean blood and dying, because that's not what martyrdom is, right? You share this concept that martyr is alive, martyr is present, martyr is a witness to history, and it's effective when it continues to be present and to bear witness. Yes, it can. Oftentimes they use the analogy of the blood, irrigating the tree of faith and community, etc., etc. Yes, that's also part of it. But the fact is that a martyr is a conscious decision, someone who is there to be present and to speak about the injustices that are occurring in order to emancipate.
Okay, we can continue this debate, I think, until tomorrow morning. But we are done. The time is over, and I would like to thank all the contributors for very eloquent and very critical approaches they have brought to our discussion. And I thank foremost Dustin Jaybird, who have made actually this platform possible. And if you have anything else to mention, if not, I hand over to Professor Dustin Jaybird.
Yes, so thank you very much. Thanks for showing up and giving your most eloquent arguments about this very important topic. I do plan on